you might have picked up from Clint's remarks, I'm glad he looked forward to see who was speaking after him today, because a lot of what it is that we're looking at was based upon ideas that it's people behind the money. It's not just money that actually matters. Money by itself doesn't matter. It's the people behind the money. And one day I was working out at the Arc, as I tend to do when I get up in the morning, partly because I can't sleep after 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was listening to National Public Radio, and I was trying to think of a theme for this particular year's symposium, and lo and behold, NPR had a little report from this economist at the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank by the name of William Emmons. And I looked into it and asked to see if he could come down and speak with us, because I think the topic that he's talking about has a lot to do with with the individual differences that exist within our society. Okay, and I think that that's one of the things that we certainly need to focus more on in terms of making a real difference. I'll just put it simply. I graduated from high school in 1970, and during the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement, I thought we'd be a whole lot farther down the road than we are in the year 2015. And I think most of you will agree with me that we've still got a long ways to go. And I think it's a very important thing for us to be talking about and to work with and actually talk to each other in order to make some differences in that. To do that, or to help us start thinking about some of the differences that do exist, Bill Emmons is next on our programs. Bill is Assistant Vice President and Economist at the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. He speaks frequently on topics including the economy, housing, mortgage markets, banking, financial markets, household financial conditions, which is certainly what today's topic is in fact about. He joined the St. Louis Fed back in 1995, and he also serves as an adjunct professor of finance at the John M. Olin Business School at Washington University that's in St. Louis. We all know that in Missouri as far as that goes. Prior to being at the St. Louis Fed, he was on the faculty at the Amos Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College back in New Hampshire. He received his PhD in finance from the Kellogg School at Northwestern University and is a alumni from the University of Illinois prior to that. So please join me in welcoming Bill Emmons to the podium.
Thank you, Rob. All right, thank you very much. Yes, and I want to echo Rob's comments. Treasurer Zweifel, I think, is an unusual public servant, very engaged, very intelligent, very forward-looking. And I want to emphasize a couple of the themes that he mentioned, just how important service is, not just if you're in the public service, but in the private sector too. We all have to be concerned about the issues Rob highlighted, what I want to talk about. And so I want to challenge you as we go through this. I'm going to speak primarily about the financial experiences of Latino and Black families, but I don't care what color your skin is, it matters for everyone. And you all are in a position to make a difference. So I want to speak to this question: why didn't higher education protect Hispanic and Black wealth? And I'll show you the numbers. I'll provide some interpretations, very tentative. This is ongoing research, and I'd be very interested in any insights any of you might have. So I'll approach this in three main steps. First, talk about the links between education and wealth. This may sound naive. Does college make you rich? But if you look at the numbers, that's at least the first impression that is going to jump off these charts that I show you. Going to college may not be the only way to accumulate wealth, but it certainly seems to be the best way. There are very, very strong links between education and wealth. And as I'll show you, they're actually getting stronger over time. So then I want to dig down a little bit and really, I guess, critique what I'm going to call the silver bullet theory of education. The idea that there's something, to overstate the idea, there's something almost magic about getting a college degree. That alone is going to provide these great outcomes that we see in the data. The second step then is to get to the real topic of this discussion, and that is to really look at what I would call the broken link between Hispanic and Black college degrees and wealth. Now, I was not aware of these numbers until recently, this year, when someone called this to my attention, that the experiences of Black and Hispanic college graduates has been different. It has not been the same over the last few years. And when we did dig into the numbers, it's very clear, very striking. So I want to point out just the raw numbers and then a little bit more sort of what I'm going to call the college wealth multiplier, comparisons between college graduates and those without college degrees. And I should have said this at the top, I should say this repeatedly as I go through this. I'm not saying that college is not a good idea. I'm not saying that it's not something to aspire to, but what I'm saying is the numbers are sobering that somehow it's not working in exactly the way that we hoped that it would across the entire population. So then I'm going to throw out some explanations. As I say, these are tentative. This is work in progress. Very interested in all of your thoughts. I'll bet Willie has some ideas. He can help me get some new ideas going in trying to look into this. So I'm going to break this down into two categories of explanations. So first, what I'll call proximate explanations, or if you will, sort of what was the, or how did this actually happen? What are the things that you can point to directly without knowing exactly what's behind it, but just how did this happen? And what appears to be the case is that there are some differences in job market experiences, labor earnings, particularly if we look at the longer term experience. But there also seem to be things in the financial lives of families. And I'll show you just briefly some data. For example, exposure to the housing market. As the housing market crashed in many, many parts of the country, families of whatever age, race, education level who were more exposed to housing, who had a larger share of their assets in housing, naturally felt that decline more significantly. Also, on the other side of the balance sheet, families that had more debt were in a more vulnerable position to declines in asset values, job loss, or other sorts of interruptions of income. And so those two, the housing exposure and the debt, appear to be proximate causes. But of course, that begs the question, why is that? Why would we see these systematic differences across groups? And as I'll mention, we've done a lot of work looking at lots of different demographic factors. So differences across the life cycle, differences in when you were born. What I'm going to talk about today, the differences in education and differences across race and ethnicity. So you see differences in all of these sorts of asset and liability positions across lots of different demographic dimensions. Okay, then the other type of cause, what I'm going to call underlying. So this is more of the why. Why did we see these patterns, whether it's in the job market, in asset and liability? Well, this maybe seems a little bit technical to some of you, but for those of us doing the research, it is very important to step back and say, well, are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring? So one potential issue is that especially when I look at these longer term comparisons, 1989 or 1992, say, versus 2013, are we actually measuring the same groups? So is the group of college graduates in 1989, are those comparable in important ways to 2013? So I'll explore that just a little bit. And then there's also again, I don't want to be too technical, but the idea that there are differences within the pool. So there may be heterogeneity, important differences due to all sorts of different reasons. And again, so maybe we're not really comparing groups that we should be comparing appropriately. So I do want to raise those questions really to say, these results are tentative. It could be that there are systematic things that we're missing, that somehow we're not interpreting the numbers correctly. And then, a few other ideas, but I am really shopping for insights and interests, suggestions on what to do. Okay, so that's the overall plan. First thing, just education and wealth. Is there a connection? Well, that's one of the biggest does you could come up with. Of course, it is enormous. It is awesome how different the wealth accumulation experiences of families of different levels of education are. So if you can see these pictures, this breaks down the population, and I should say all of these data come from the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances. Now we have about a quarter century of very high quality data on the population. So I'm breaking the population, or actually the sample, down into four groups. From the bottom of the chart, families headed by someone who did not finish high school, then families headed by someone who has a high school diploma or a GED, then the third line, the red line, families headed, and these could be single individuals too, families headed by someone whose highest level of education is a 2 or 4 year college degree, and then the highest line, the blue, are families headed by someone with a postgraduate degree, a law degree, medical degree, PhD, master's. Okay? And I think you can see that there's a big gap. And in fact, one of the surprises to me when we got into these numbers is just how these gaps get bigger as you go up to successively higher levels of education. This chart is shown as relative to the overall median, and these are medians for the groups, that is the family that ranks exactly in the middle. So from the bottom, you can see that families without high school diplomas have about half of the income. Did I say wealth? This is income. Families whose head is a high school grad are slightly below the median, which is not too surprising because when you rank everybody by education, the typical person, the median person, has a high school diploma. That's the biggest group. The next group, 2 or 4 year college, has about 50% more income than the median. But look at that top line. The postgraduate families have almost 2.5 times the income of the median family, the typical family. All right? The median is the middle. So if you rank everybody, I think I have it in another chart. It would be, it changes over time. It's in the order of 50,000. Yes?
You said that graph didn't take into account single earner or dual earner households.
All families are just ranked as a family unit.
Do you have any idea what the chart would look like if you were controlling for that variable?
We have not done that. That's yeah, something we would I would put that down on my list as things, we would like to look into. Differences in family size, for example. Now, for the story in this picture, and then more generally for the discussion today, if those differences are systematic across race or ethnicity or systematic across education groups, the numbers are going to look different, but that begs the question, well, why? Why are the family structures different? So you're right that we have sort of suppressed that at this point. And so, if you will, the hidden assumption here is that that's not an important part of this story, that the main thing driving these differences is, in fact, education. All right, so that's income. This is income. You thought that was big? Look at wealth. So here is the breakdown across different levels of education, again, expressed relative to the population median, which in this, I do know these numbers a little bit better offhand. The 2013 median family wealth was about $81,000. So the less than high school, you can see, the lowest line is 20%, I don't remember the exact number, 30% of the median. High school diploma is significantly below the median. College is about twice median. And look at the postgraduate, about 6 times the median. So in fact, wealth accumulation, much more than income, is skewed toward those with more education, and especially the highest levels of education. Okay, so these are just numbers, just correlations. We haven't really dug down to think what's going on here. This is just to provide you some framework to think about this. And here are the actual numbers. So, for example, the highest group there, the postgraduate, the median postgraduate family has about $450,000 of net worth. That is assets minus liabilities. That's the median. Half of families have more, half have less with that education level. And you can see this, as I said, this enormous gap as you go up the education rankings. So, I started out by saying, does college make you rich? Well, maybe does postgraduate education make you rich? These numbers would suggest, well, there's something there. But I'm going to argue, well, it's more complicated than that. You can't simply give somebody a college degree and say, oh, you are now going to fall into this category. And as I said, not only are the levels striking, the trends over time are pushing toward greater inequality. This is wealth again. So taking those numbers from the previous chart, putting them all back on a starting point of 100, so we can trace out then the cumulative percent change across different groups. If you see the line that's going down at the bottom there, the purple line, less than high school, families with less than a high school diploma have 60% less wealth, the typical family, today versus a quarter century ago. And then at the top of the chart, the blue line, postgraduates have something on the order of 25% more wealth, families with that level of education versus a quarter century ago. So what this is saying is those families with the least wealth a quarter century ago lost the most, and the families with the most wealth gained the most. So this is a huge part of the income and wealth inequality discussion we're having, and what annoys me is that this aspect of it is not often discussed. It's no mystery, in a sense, why we're seeing these big wealth disparities, because the rewards to education seem to be growing. Yes?
And I don't mean to get too far in the weeds here, trust me. I just have a question when you talk about wealth and how you measure
Right.
wealth. Does that take into account for any of these categories, pensions,
Okay, good question.
IRA accounts?
All of the defined contribution type accounts that Treasurer Zweifel was talking about, all those are included. Defined benefit, the old traditional company pension based on some formula, is not included, nor is Social Security, future value of Social Security included.
Okay, so but if somebody has a 401k,
401ks are in here, IRAs, 529s, they're all here. Yep. Okay, and so here are the percent changes from that previous chart from 1989 to 2013 by education, and you can see very clearly this gradient, this relationship. Families with the least amount of education have done very poorly over time, and families with the most education have done very well comparatively over this quarter century. So that's a huge part of what's going on in the, I'm showing you wealth, you see somewhat similar pictures for income. So there's another aspect to this. So I want to show you, this is back in 1989. On the left, the share of all families in our sample that had different levels of education. So about half of families, highest education was high school a quarter century ago. I didn't realize this till I looked at these data. About a quarter of families back in 1989 were headed by someone without a high school diploma. A quarter of families headed by someone without a high school diploma. That's surprising to me. Then you can see the college and postgraduate shares there, together making up about 28% of families. Then on the right, what share of total wealth do those groups of educated families have? And not surprisingly, college families have disproportionately more wealth. You saw that from the numbers before, and it's about 55% of total wealth versus 28% share of all families. Now, fast forward to 2013, same pictures. The share of high school grads is still about 50% of all families. The share of people without a high school diploma has shrunk considerably, and that's been a major accomplishment in many respects. Now it's down to only about 11%. Correspondingly, we have more college graduates in the population and more people with postgraduate education. And then on the right, you can see that the share of wealth owned by college graduates is now 75%. So this was my point before, that this seems to be increasingly associated with people with education, college and beyond. And there are actually two things going on here. Not only is the number of families with college increasing, you saw that, but the average level or median level of wealth of each college family is increasing. So those two things together are causing this widening disparity across education levels. So all of these numbers, of course, and you know, a lot of discussions would kind of end here and say, well, we've got to get everybody to college. End of conversation. But I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I'll call that the silver bullet theory of education. The idea that more education, especially college, might overcome other disadvantages, such as the racial and ethnic income and wealth gaps that I want to talk about. Why do people say that? Well, because there are studies upon studies that show that education, or higher education, is correlated with things like better outcomes in the job market. People earn more income. They have greater financial literacy. They have better health. They live longer. They have higher socioeconomic status, those sort of softer aspects of where you fit into your community. Better child outcomes, stronger marriages, lower criminality, lower chance of being in poverty, greater civic involvement. What's not to like? These are the things that we think build strong families, build strong communities, and all of these things are strongly related to education. Okay, so I hope some of you are sort of thinking, though, but is college magic? So I would argue educational attainment is a proxy for many other factors that contribute to a person's success. Okay, so here's college, and we can associate college with all of these good things, but is that, in a sense, what you learn in college classes? Not to downplay that, but is that alone what's causing all of these good outcomes? And I would argue, well, it's part of it, but it's probably not all of it. There are what I would call background factors. The role that your parents play in getting you into a position to succeed at college or beyond. The role of your own interests, aptitudes, non-cognitive skills, your ambition, your perseverance, your grit. You didn't learn that in college, you brought that to college with you. And then all of the networks that your parents may provide for you or your communities may provide for you. Your religious organizations may provide. There's a lot of things that make it possible for you as an individual to succeed at college. It's not simply, not to downplay college, but it's not simply the fact that you spent 4 years in Columbia, Missouri, or wherever it might be. So that complicates this whole discussion, I think, but I think we do need to grapple with it. So let me now start digging into the data. These are numbers for 2013 from our sample. The top are income numbers, and it's mostly what people earn from their jobs. And on the bottom is net worth, or wealth, assets minus liabilities. So this is broken out into 2 groups by education and 4 groups by race and ethnicity. So you can see the first column of numbers there. These are only families who have a 4-year college degree or more. And the second column numbers is everybody else. Families headed by someone who did not finish a 4-year college degree. And I'll speak to that final column in just a minute. So in the top table, family incomes, first got listed the all families median. So this is a partial response to your earlier question. So $87,000 is the median family income of college families. $36,500 is the median income for families without college. Huge, right? That's a big difference. In fact, the multiple, that's what the third column is, 2.4 times higher for families with college across the entire population. And then broken down white, Asian, Hispanic, and black, you can see the numbers. They are all much higher among college grads than non-college grads within a racial or ethnic group. But you can certainly see that there are differences across racial and ethnic groups within college or within non-college. So these racial and ethnic group differences persist even when you break down across education levels. And then the bottom chart is the same breakdown for wealth. And as you picked up in the earlier pictures, if anything, the differences are larger in terms of wealth compared to income. And not least, on that far right-hand column, the multiples, how much more college graduates earn relative to non-college grads, is higher for whites and Asians. This is what I'm going to call the wealth multiplier. Seems to be more powerful for whites and Asians than for Latinos and blacks. Okay, so this was what Rob was talking about, a short article I wrote with a colleague, came out in August of this year with the title that I've already used for the talk today, Why Didn't Higher Education Protect Hispanic and Black Wealth? There were very large losses, I'll show you this, particularly during the recession, the housing market crash, and there's been a very weak recovery. And then even when you look at the longer term, the differences are are pretty stark. So what we did, and I've already kind of hinted at this, showed you some of these numbers. We followed 8 groups across this quarter century of data. So we're looking at the 4 racial and ethnic identities, and these are in fact self-identified by survey respondents. It's also the case that an individual may respond with more than one racial or ethnic identity, either for him or herself or another member of the family. So this is using the first one mentioned, what the respondent presumably thinks of as their primary racial or ethnic identity. And then also the 2 education levels. Do you have a 4-year college degree or not? And then I will come back to this. As I said already at the top, we don't claim to understand exactly why all of this is happening. And there are even these basic things. Maybe we're not even comparing things that should be compared. Maybe the distance in time is too great, or maybe these breakdowns are too blunt, essentially saying that all college graduates should look alike, or that the differences across racial and ethnic groups are not important when you break down by education. So all those things we are very much aware. We're thinking about that, trying to dig deeper into this. And this is available on our website. Okay, so here are the 8 groups. This is median wealth from 1989 through 2013. This survey occurs every 3 years. The solid lines there are college graduate families. The dashed lines are families without college. And you can see the labels. The most wealthy group are white college graduates. The next group is Asian. And you can already see here, there's something of an overlap between the college and the non-college groups, and I'll show you that more clearly in just a second. So here are all the college graduate groups. And what was really striking, and this is really kind of what got us interested in this issue, is what's happening in the 2007, 10, 13 period, the period that spans the Great Recession and the housing market crash. I should say this is a semi-logarithmic chart, so the vertical axis is logarithmic, and that allows us to express percentage changes more clearly. And so it's a little bit different from what you would see with a different kind of chart. But the real benefit is we can interpret the slope of a line as the percentage change. So you can see those 2 lower lines, the green and the purple lines representing Hispanic and black families, had very negative percent changes. The slopes of those lines are very negative, whereas for white and Asian families most recently, they were closer to flat. So that's really what perked up our attention, is what's going on there? Why were there such large losses of wealth among Latino and black college families? This is the point that there's an overlap, and it's been both ways over this sample period, but it is now back to a situation in which Latino and black college families at the median have lower wealth than white families without college. And it doesn't seem like that should be the case. That picture there. Okay, so that's the first fact, that you had these big, big losses that just jump out for black and Hispanic college grads. Second fact, and I should say, these are pieces of evidence that the silver bullet theory of education can't be right. Because why would you have seen these big disparities across racial and ethnic groups among college graduates? So the second piece of evidence against the silver bullet theory is that even comparing black families with college versus no college and Latino families with college, no college, it's the families with college that did worse. This is during the recessionary period, 7 to 13. So these families with college had more wealth, but in percentage terms, they lost more than families without college. And you can see that that's not generally the case for white and Asian families. I mean, this was a tough period for everybody, but among whites, for example, the losses among college families were less, percentage-wise, than they were for non-college, and even more so among Asian families. Then the third piece of evidence that the silver bullet theory doesn't seem to be accurate is over, excuse me, over a longer term perspective. So this is about 2 decades now, and this is the change in wealth across 20 plus years for the 8 groups. And what I would highlight is college graduates first, those orange bars. Among whites and Asians, college graduate earnings were higher, and net wealth grew significantly, almost doubled for the typical white family and typical Asian family over that period. At the same time, the typical black and Hispanic family actually experienced losses over the long period. So that, I say, runs counter to the idea that education alone might be able to overcome the racial and ethnic wealth gaps. And then the other piece of it that I hinted at before, showed you, was that even comparing within black families and Latino families, those with college did worse, lost wealth over this 20-year period. So there's something that's not working in the way that we expected. The other aspect, another way to think about this, is what I called the college wealth multiplier. How much better or higher is wealth among college graduates versus non-college graduates? So I'll show you 2 ways. This is with comparing the means, so the average wealth across different groups. And I've suppressed the Asian partly because it's just so noisy. But this is, and this is actually smoothed. I'm looking over 3 consecutive sample periods. But I think this makes it more clear. If you first look at if you can identify the white line, which is the blue, it's rising from a little below 3 to about 4.5. So this is saying over this quarter-century period, the advantage in terms of how much wealth families have among college grads has increased. So the wealth multiplier of college seems to have gone up for whites over this period. For Hispanics, gone up maybe a little bit, but among black families, it's actually gone down. So the relative advantage of college families versus non-college has gone from a bit over 4 down to about 3. So that's a little puzzling. And then here's measuring by the medians, comparing the median college family versus the median non-college family. Again, the white number, the blue line there, goes up on balance over the period, and for black and Hispanic families, this wealth multiplier is going down. So what's happening? So what are the proximate causes? I'll look at income, and I'm going to actually argue in this 2007 to 13 period, it's not so clear. The income trends are kind of all over the board, so it's really hard to say that that was the main thing. It is no doubt the case that black and Hispanic unemployment rates spiked more than they did for whites and Asians. But when you see the income numbers, it's kind of mixed across the different groups. But what does seem to be more clearly, at least correlated, and that's why I say it's a proximate cause. How did this happen? Both higher concentrations in housing among black and Hispanic families, including college families, and higher debt ratios. Now I'm going to look at the longer term, and when you take that 20-year perspective, it is much more striking, I think, more compelling to argue that there are differences in the income experiences, the job market experiences, which could be related to discrimination, could be related to other structural factors that are more clear in the longer term picture. Okay, so just taking those in turn, here's the sort of not clear what the income impacts were. This is 2007 to 13, so this recession period across the 8 groups. And first looking at whites, college-educated whites actually did worse than non-college-educated whites. Well, in the earlier pictures, with wealth, college graduates always did better. So this doesn't really line up with that. It does more so for Asians. But then looking at Hispanics and blacks, again, it's mixed. It's not clearly the case that college-educated Latino and black families did worse. In fact, for Latinos, they did better. So this doesn't seem, at least on its face, to be entirely persuasive. So that's the college-educated educated does line up, but then some of these other comparisons, as I said, don't really, like that one there. Okay, so that probably contributes something, but I don't think it's the main thing going on. So I'm going to argue that it has maybe more to do with what's going on with assets and liabilities, with balance sheets. Okay, so there's a lot of information here. I don't plan to go through all of it, but this is just a way to depict 4 different racial and ethnic groups in the 4 quadrants: African American, Hispanic, non-Hispanic whites, and Asians. And this is now using the full scope of our data, breaking out 4 different education levels and 3 different age groups. And as I say, I'm not going to go into this other than simply to just show you that there's heterogeneity, there's differences across each of these dimensions. And the ones I'm really highlighting here are the racial and ethnic differences. And so those numbers are in the middle in that box. And so this is the average share of assets invested in housing. So how much of a family's total assets are in housing? And there do appear to be clear differences across racial and ethnic groups. Around 60% on average of Latino and Black assets are housing, closer to 40% among Asians and whites. And this was from 2007, which was close to the peak. 2004, 2007 probably spans the peak in housing prices across most of the country. So then here's 2013, and I think the visual impression is, wow, housing got slammed, which is true. Let me do that again. Here's 2007, and then just look at 2013. And of course, you can see particular areas like younger people got hit very hard, especially, say, African American young people had a huge decline in housing assets. But it was true across many different groups. So now the concentrations are somewhat lower, in the mid-50s for Black and Hispanic families, somewhere in the 33 to 43% range for whites and Asians. So at least this I think, does qualify as a proximate cause for the wealth losses: higher concentrations, higher exposures to housing losses among Black and Hispanic families. On the other side of the balance sheet, here's going back to the 8 groups, 2 education levels for racial and ethnic groups, measured in terms of debt to income, which is not perfect, but it's a proxy for how much of your cash flow is dedicated to debt service, but also how vulnerable are you to losses in asset values, losses of a job, income interruptions of various types. And here, not only did, in particular, Black and Hispanic college grads had higher debt-to-income ratios than white and Asian college grads, and significantly more than non-college grads of all races and ethnicities. So as I say, these are proximate causes. We don't know why this is the case, but these seem to line up with the differences that we see across education levels and within race and ethnicity. So let me then step back to the longer-term perspective. That was just the recession period. What about the last 20 years or so? And as I mentioned, here I think the job market differences are more compelling. So this is the comparison, the change in typical family income, which is mostly job market outcomes. And you can see the white and Asian college grads did well, and that conforms with the narrative that we've been hearing, that to succeed in the job market, increasingly you need college skills. And that is true for white and Asian families compared to their counterparts with no college. You can see stagnation of incomes. But it does not conform for the experience of Black and Hispanic families. Almost paradoxically, Black and Hispanic families without college had more favorable long-term income trends. So, as I say, that's, again, it pushes the question back, so why? What's going on there? But I think it gets a little closer to maybe some things that we could start to identify. So let me revisit this question. I think I have a time to revisit this question. Maybe we're completely missing something here. Maybe we're comparing apples and oranges in some sense. So maybe the 2013 college graduate is just such a different animal than the 1989 college graduate, we shouldn't even be comparing them. But for that to be an important explanation, part of this story, I think it would have to be the case that maybe something like the incentives to attend college may have evolved differently across race and ethnicity. And that is plausible. Perhaps attitudes have changed or opportunities have changed. So maybe we're not really comparing like with like across time. So my intuition is that that's not the entire story. It could be part of it, but I don't know. Then the second category, I would say, is just a basic, and this seems obvious, but in any research you have to make simplifications. This is a simplification we made. We put all college graduates together and essentially assume, well, all college graduates are kind of the same. Well, that's probably not right, but in what sense is that wrong? Could it be, well, in fact, we can point to a few things where it's not quite right. For example, Latino and black college grads are more likely to be women. A higher fraction of women who are black and Latino have college grads versus white and Asian. And we know that there are continuing barriers in the job market for women. So maybe that's part of what's going on. It's not really a black and Hispanic versus white and Asian. Maybe it's a women versus men issue in terms of how college is working. Another possibility, Latino and black college grads are likely to graduate, less likely to graduate from highly selective colleges. So maybe there's a difference in people's aspirations, their job market expectations. Another possibility, Latino and black college grads are less likely to major in STEM subjects. And we know there's a premium put on engineering, for example. So if there are fewer engineers among a graduating class, they're going to have lower incomes, most likely. And then the fourth possibility, and there are more, of course, that you could think about, it is the case that a smaller percent of Latino and black college grads get postgraduate degrees. And I showed you that big premium put on postgraduate education. So that could be part of why, when we just compare college grads versus college grads, that's partly what it's picking up. Yes?
Another variable that may be of significance is nonprofit versus for-profit.
Yes. So the question is, different. I think I got that on the next. Yeah. So I've put it into a category called mismatch, which is kind of a broad term to say either changes in the labor market, what field you go into, what employer you get. So a way to say that is Latino and black college grads may select or be steered into majors and or colleges that are not appropriate for them. Maybe there's a degree of mismatch. Fit is not good. Maybe it could be that Latino and black college grads are obtaining skills that are falling out of favor in the job market. The job market is very dynamic. It's changing. So maybe, again, that could be partly due to counseling that people are getting. Latino and black college grads may not obtain the skills that are conducive to building wealth. Personal financial management. That could be systematically differing across groups. And again, I don't know. That's why we need to do more research. But my intuition is that these things may matter, but it may not explain everything. And then the other explanations that I could think of is it is in fact the case that black and Hispanic families or students take on more student debt. They're more likely to take on student loans, have higher balances related to the fact that their families have less wealth. So that might in fact be really influencing what happens after college because black and Hispanic young graduates are carrying more student debt, so it makes it more difficult. Maybe hampering wealth accumulation. And I think it is absolutely part of the story that there is continuing discrimination. I don't know exactly how much or which of these is the most important, but in college admissions, inside classrooms, in hiring, in the workplace, in housing markets, in credit markets, all of these things. And they may be small individually, but maybe they accumulate. Maybe that's a part of the story, and I think we do need to keep that as part of the conversation. So, as I said, I think the college degree by itself, which really is a stand-in, it's a proxy for all of these things that make it possible for you to succeed, And maybe that's what's different across racial and ethnic groups. Maybe the ability of parents to provide that financial support, the ability to provide those early experiences, the networks that parents may provide or communities may provide. Maybe those are less present, less powerful, and so maybe that silver bullet for a Black or Hispanic college graduate is not as powerful, which of course I think leads toward, that's means we got a lot of work to do, but thinking more broadly than simply college attendance and even beyond college graduation, but all of those background factors that may differentially make it possible for someone to succeed. So, summing it up, I showed you many Hispanic and Black college grads have lost large amounts of wealth in recent years. I think the housing exposures and debt burdens are part of that in the short term. In the longer term, there appear to be significant, some people might say systemic differences in the job market still across Black, Hispanic versus white Asian college grads. And I would submit to you that this is not simply an esoteric research question, but something that matters more broadly in understanding this broken link between, what I would call a broken link between Latino and Black college grads and wealth accumulation. And I think, as I said, this is a group that actually does have some, I think, some ability to have some impact, some influence on this issue. So I'll just, last thing, point to, we did a three-part series looking at three demographic dimensions of wealth. This most recent work that I was discussing is really kind of combining these dimensions now, trying to put that together and in a little bit more of an integrative picture, but this provides some background information. So with that, Rob? Thank you.
I didn't say this earlier, but if people need to get up and go to the restroom, whatever, feel free to do that. But we have some time for some questions. Anybody has some questions? You were late last time, so here, I'll give it to you first, Gary.
In my lifetime, I've noticed a great difference between white people who save and white people who do not. Their education is less important than their savings rate. It is also an obvious question for your study. If a man makes $75,000 a year and saves nothing, he has no wealth accumulation. If a man makes $75,000 and saves 25%, he is on the road to success. I noticed no data provided by race and savings rate. I would suggest you put a chart up showing graduates making $75,000 by race and their savings. This can be affected. Education can affect success, and it doesn't blame anybody. A man who saves money saves money.
The issue from a sort of a research perspective is that saving is the result, just like education, even more so, it's the result of a whole bunch of background factors. So you're right that would fit into the proximate cause category. It would not be an ultimate cause because the saving rate itself is coming out of a lot of things. There is some research that suggests if you control for a whole bunch of these background factors, differences across racial and ethnic groups are not very significant. If you look at the raw savings rates, obviously educated people are going to save a lot more, but that's because of a lot of things that are contributing to their educational success, contributing to higher income, and contributing to savings. So in a sense, I'm sympathetic, but I guess I would classify I think what you're driving at, and I do believe that it is recognized in this work, is that there are individual differences, no matter how you cut the population, by age, race, education, hair color, whatever, you will get differences across people. And for reasons we don't fully understand, some people save more than other people. For example, a perfect example of this is generations. One of the reasons that older people seem to be doing so much better today is they had high savings rates. And there are people who have argued, particularly those who lived through the Great Depression, they just view the world differently and they save a lot more. So I think you're right. I think the savings rate per se is not the right way to attack this. That's sort of the outcome of a whole bunch of other processes.
Thank you very much for
Sure.
coming here and speaking with us and giving us this presentation. It's very insightful. Quick question, just simply on the laws of supply and demand as far as college degrees and graduates
Right.
are concerned. I don't know the exact numbers, and I'm not going to assume that I do know, but being as there's more college students these days, could that just simply be one of those parts of the problem?
Yes, I think you're right, and I kind of tried to get at that changes in the job market. So, I was pointing out about the skills that you learn. Maybe the job market has moved, and the skill you have is no longer as valuable as it used to be. And if there are systematic differences, or I mentioned the differences in majoring in engineering versus some other fields. If there are systematic differences, that could be part of what's going on. And I think there are people who are focusing on exactly those things. I would mention, and maybe this is part of what you're getting at, there is research that suggests, I didn't highlight it at all here, but those historical advantages, sort of riding the up escalator for education seem to be slowing down a little bit, which is not to, it doesn't negate the fact that the gaps between college and non-college are still growing. The issue is that the fate of individuals with less than college are getting much worse. So the college premium, wage premium, is still growing, even though college wages have flattened out, so they're not growing as much. But you're right that within college grads, differences in your skills or whatever it is that employers are looking for certainly would make a difference.
Right. And you said over the last quarter of a century, wealth accumulation has increased by white college graduates over the last quarter century. Do you think that another part of the problem might be that African Americans and Latinos may not necessarily have had that generational advantage?
Absolutely.
Because now everybody has more incentive to attend college,
Right.
and now they're being able to come about the means of attending college. Maybe they're a little late arriving to the party.
Yes, and putting together an earlier comment about families. I was in a program yesterday, and someone pointed this out, used this term, I hadn't thought of this before, but the density of college graduates is very different. I didn't show those numbers. So another problem really with not breaking this out more finely by family structure is what about families that have 2 college graduates in them? And that's going to be much more likely among white and Asian families simply because there are just more college graduates. That's what this gentleman called the density. And so that would be an argument for, even though it doesn't look right now that the college premium is paying off as much for Black and Hispanic families, part of it, and I maybe should have put that on my list of potential causes, part of it is because there are fewer Black and Hispanic 2 college degree families. And so maybe there is a sense in which just increasing that density is going to have that effect, plus what you're talking about, the intergenerational, which I was pointing to with the role of the parents and the role of the social network, and making it possible for young people to get through without too much student debt. So yeah, those prior generations absolutely are part of what's going on. And that's really kind of part of the message I'm trying to say, is that it's not just the individual, it's the whole context from which an individual comes. And it would be, I think, unrealistic to say everybody comes from the same context. There are systematic differences across groups.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, sir.
By training, I'm a sociologist, so I'm utterly fascinated by this presentation.
Sure. I learned a lot from sociologists lately.
Data indicate that for-profit colleges hold a huge amount of minority students, and they tend to charge ridiculous amounts of money and have really, really poor job market outcomes. Do you have a way to divide college graduates in your sample population between what kind of college they attend? Is that a variable that can be analyzed?
Unfortunately, no. That's one of the weaknesses of this data set. In fact, I asked the guy at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington who runs this survey now, can we do that? And he said, no, really can't do that. The other two, since we're pointing out weaknesses, The other two, I would say, big weaknesses in this data, we don't have any geographic information for privacy reasons. They won't tell us where anybody lives, particularly for the very wealthy people. They don't want to be reverse engineered. And the other thing is we don't have any information on your parents, and particularly for this story that I'm telling. And I was thrilled to learn when I talked to this guy in Washington that in the next version of this survey in 2016, they will be asking about your parents' education. And as I have said, if we had that variable, I actually would probably use that one, your parents' education, rather than your education, to get at the idea of this context, the background, the family. Not that it guarantees anything, but that it provides whatever, context.
Walk faster.
Thank you for coming out.
Sure.
My question has to do with, we understand first that housing plays a major role, if not the most significant role in wealth. And the push towards suburban housing, the suburbs, was pretty, pretty intense maybe 15 years ago. And now it seems that research is showing more people are going towards the city. How do you think this factors in as far as the self-segregation in housing, how people self-select to move here and to the suburbs? Especially one of your slides was showing non-college graduates in wealth, and we would look at the white wealth was $80,000 on one of those slides, and then the next down was $25,000. And the decrease now, since most young individuals are moving towards the city, and the city tends to have either very, cheap housing or very exclusive housing, that's very expensive. How much of a factor do you think that comes? And also when they buy the housing.
Absolutely, yeah, the timing, and that's why in our generational story, people who were born in about 1970 drew the short straw in the birth lottery. That was the worst time to be born in the second half of the 20th century, for sure, because of the timing. You were just getting into the housing market just as it was getting near the peak. To your broader question, I think that is, and that probably, again, that could go on to this list of causes. There is evidence that Black and Hispanic families' housing markets have performed more poorly. So it could be a timing question for some people. It could be simply sort of a neighborhood question. And that raises a whole host of questions about if we could have anticipated that. And I think there is some historical evidence that neighborhoods that had more Black and Hispanic housing maybe were more volatile. There were big increases in the 2000s and then big decreases. Should we, and that sort of suits us or fits into all of your thinking, I think, in terms of risk and return trade-offs, that through no fault of a Black or Hispanic homeowner, housing may be a riskier investment simply because of these neighborhood characteristics. There seems to be a lot more volatility. Now, I'm not sure how it breaks down suburban versus city, but I think that is, and I know people have looked at that, and that certainly is reflected in these numbers. Depressed housing values still through 2013 in some neighborhoods, maybe more likely to be Black and Hispanic families.
I have a two-part question.
Yes.
My first question is, does your data look at mixed race families, like a whole household that may have a Hispanic member and then maybe a white member, or Black and Hispanic? And second of all, as a Hispanic female graduate, what do you think our outlook would look like? Do you think there's going to be a shift later on, or can we kind of just expect some bleak, a bleak outlook?
No, for young people, you have the opportunity, and that's the point of this, to say, there are challenges, and that's why I'm saying throwing it out to the whole group. It's not incumbent only upon Black and Hispanic families. Everybody needs to be aware and thinking about how to make a difference. So no, I don't think it's necessarily a bleak outlook. We have challenges. On the first question, again, these compromises you make in research, we put everybody into one category, even if they were mixed race. And that it is, the survey asks people to identify asks how they identify. So there is a variety, and you know, we've thought a little bit about maybe trying to be more nuanced about that. Again, from the research perspective, then you get into small groups of people, and it makes it much more difficult to be confident that you're picking up real results. So you're right, that is a weakness in the sense that we know that not everybody fits neatly into one of these boxes.
Willie's given up some of his time for another question.
Oh, I'll buy you a beer, Willie.
I might have missed it, but one thing that I think could be added is the increase in cost. For example, the statistics that college does cost, well, the cost of college has tripled in the last 20, 30 years. So that also affects, you know, savings and things like that, and that the barriers that minorities face are very real. Like you mentioned, women are in school more than men, and getting into jobs after college is kind of more difficult. So as costs go up, it's kind of harder for generations that are passed down to end up saving more money. And like I said, the inflation rate is just ridiculously non-paralleled to like the increase in salaries and things of that nature. So it only gets worse and worse. And another thing, you named all these facts and things like that, but at the same time, like this is my reality. You know what I'm saying? This is what I live with every day. So it's nice that you provide this information for information or for other people. But at the same time, like, do you have any solutions or any advice?
And I agree with you. That's the point, is to say, you know, people need to understand that this college works differently for different people, and that wealth component. I think actually this is a question for you, Willie. That you know, the wealth of the family and the savings of the family have a huge impact on the child. And they're, you know, increasingly, I think researchers and hopefully policymakers are understanding this is typically a multi-generational you know, endeavor, and your family background matters a huge amount. So, and I think, Willie, that maybe is something that you want to talk about. Okay. Thank you.